And hello, everyone. Welcome to this session as we commemorate the centennial of Portuguese language radio in California. It is a pleasure to be here and to have a bit of a chat with you about this centennial celebration. We're going to go over some dates, some key figures, and we'll also talk a little bit about some of the repercussions that radio had in the Portuguese American community throughout the state of California. We are also on Facebook Live if you would like to join us there. And these these sessions will be recorded. We will also be archiving these through the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, our YouTube channel, PBBI, and of course at our library. This is part of our oral history project at the California-Centennial University, Fresno, through Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, and through the project that we received a grant from the Luso-American Development Foundation, a Fundação Luso-Americana para o Desenvolvimento, FLAD in Lisbon, Portugal. So a little bit about the history of Portuguese radio in California. The interesting thing is that radio began exactly in California, Portuguese radio, when radio also began in the United States of America. The first radio stations, established radio stations, were being set up throughout the U.S. in the end of 1919 and beginning of 1920. There had been lots of different experiments, but radio stations set up as such were at the end of the 1919 and beginning of the 1920s. So we're celebrating indeed also the centennial of radio stations in general throughout the U.S. And it's quite fascinating that on June 10th of exactly 1920, it was a Thursday that year in the afternoon. We don't have, unfortunately, the time. We've tried our best to get it, and hopefully, as the research continues, we can pinpoint the time, but we know it was in the afternoon from someone who has done an interview, Mr. Frank Mendonça, did an interview with Euclides Alves, who still today has a Portuguese radio program in the Hilmar area, now broadcast through various radio stations on the internet. And during that about 35 to 40-minute conversation, it's a fascinating conversation. And then I thank Euclides for giving it to us at PBBI, because there's a lot of history of radio, a lot of personal stuff, but a lot of history of radio and the Portuguese presence in California. So we do know that it was on the 10th of June of 1920 that a then young man by the name of José Vitorino began this Portuguese language radio program called Vasco da Gama. Now, according to this interview that was put forth by Mr. Mendonça, as I mentioned, over 40 years ago, he had already ended his program, and he was an elderly man at that time. Mr. Mendonça said that José Vitorino was from the island of Terceira, and that José Vitorino was illiterate. He did not know how to read or write. And it's fascinating that the very first Portuguese radio program in California to serve our community in 1920, we already had a substantial community, was by a man who did not know how to read or write. And he had a friend that knew how to play guitar. And that friend would take his guitar with him, and that's how they did the show. Mr. José Vitorino would talk about things in the community, things that were happening in the community, had ads, of course, and the music was played live by Mr. Vitorino's friend. And so this was June 10th of 1920. Mr. Vitorino continued with his program for quite a while, into the 1930s. But he was the only one with a Portuguese radio program in the Stockton, Modesto area. It was started in that area. And according to Mr. Mendonça, about 3 years later, so around 1923, he began one with an associate that Mr. Mendonça did not say the name, did not recall, in the city of Visalia. And so we weren't aware of that, because we have registered as the very, very first Portuguese radio program in Tulare County in 1937 by Mr. Inácio dos Santos, and his wife Margarida, that some of people in the community that are my age or older would remember Mr. Inácio dos Santos. I remember him quite well. I had the pleasure of being his colleague. I began my radio program in 1977, the year that then he later on he ended his show, but or he transferred to another colleague, Joe Silva. But I knew Mr. Inácio dos Santos pretty well, and his wife Margarida, and so so we know now that there was somewhere in Visalia a radio program that was an extension of the program that Mr. Vitorino had begun 3 years earlier in the Stockton Modesto. According to Mr. Mendonça, and according to this interview, the program in Visalia was very short-lived. Obviously, it was a long way from Modesto to Visalia. It still is a long way, but certainly in the 1920s. And there was, he had a partner here in the South Valley, and according to Mr. Mendonça, the partnership didn't last very, very long, but he did continue then with the program called Vasco da Gama, the name of a very famous Portuguese navigator. He did continue with the program in the Stockton Modesto area. And so the program continued into the 1930s. We don't have the exact date when it ended, but the best we could pinpoint from that interview with Mr. Mendonça and some other data, it was probably in the mid to late 30s. And then in 1930 exactly, another radio program began, and this was kind of the first so-called daily in the aspect that Mr. José Vitorino and his program Vasco da Gama was only a weekly show. It was once a week on Thursdays. And so that's why we are doing this on Thursdays, to commemorate this historic date, the centennial. Mr. Artur Vieira Ávila and his wife Celeste, better known as Rosinha, and they began a radio program in 1930 in the Oakland area. Now, Mr. Ávila was a veteran of the Portuguese press in California. He had been involved before 1930 in a group of newspapers that had been published in different parts of the state. But in the city of Oakland, he began his program called Castelos Românticos, or Romantic Castles. And the program was 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. And it began in 1930. And it was a morning show. And it was probably one of the most popular radio programs throughout California, certainly, obviously in the Portuguese language, certainly in the 1930s and well into the 40s, 50s, and even 60s. They continued with their program for many years. Mr. Artur Vieira Ávila was a man that, of course, was not illiterate. He knew how to read and write very well. He has 2 published books that I have here. One of them called Desafio Radiofónico, basically different verses that were done through the radio. And he has another one that he published called Rimas de imigrante, Rhymes from an Immigrant. And both of these were published, ironically, the same year, 1961. So 31 years after he had began his radio program. He was a learned man. He was a newspaper man. He read a lot. And him and his wife, Rosinha, had a very, very popular radio program in California. In 1930, there were other programs that popped up. And we know that there was a program that popped up here in Tulare. And from the information that we were able to collect, and this was not collected by Professor Eduardo Meian Dias, who has done the most extensive research on the Portuguese communities in California so far, and especially on Portuguese radio itself. Now, there was also, there have been other people that have done extensive research on the presence of the Portuguese radio in California, but published, Dr. Eduardo Meian Dias is the one that has done that. And so in the 1930s, in the late 1930s, according to an interview that we did for the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute, our oral history project, an interview to a young man, 93 years young, Mr. George Lemon. He talked about Gus Simas, Gustavo Simas, that went by Gus Simas, that in the late 1930s began a Portuguese radio program here in Tulare, California, as a daily, a daily Portuguese program. We had started one in 1937, as I mentioned. Inácio and Margarida dos Santos began their program Portugal, and that was a weekly program. And that program, until today, is still the longest running radio program that we know of in California and probably in the United States of America. Because Mr. Inácio dos Santos and his wife Margarida had the program until 1977, and then in 1977, Joe and Maria Humberta Silva took over the program, and they continued until 1997. So the program was on the air for 60 years, uninterrupted. Currently, Miguel Canti Castro, who is a veteran of radio, still on radio today, has a program that on the 2nd of July of this year is 59 years old. And in 2021, he will be celebrating his 60th year on radio. But up until now, the longest running program, no longer existent, is Programa Portugal, that was started by the Santos family here in Tulare, California in 1937. And as I mentioned, according to Mr. George Lemon, in 1939, another program, this one was called Voz dos Açores, or the Voice of the Azores, was started by a man identified as Gustavo Simas, that went by Gus Simas. And these were the programs that continued into the 1940s and 50s. And with an occasional program, there was a man by the name of Azevedo who also began a program up in the Turlock, Modesto area in the 1940s. And Mr. Frank Mendonça, with his program, Francamente Falando, or Frankly Speaking, began his show, his program, and his program was the very first program. It was broadcast out of Merced, and it was the very first program that was 7 days a week. So his program took it a step forward from the Castelos Românticos of the Avila couple, and it was 7 days a week, every single day. Mr. Mendonça had also a different particular aspect to his program. Up until then, all of the radio programs in California were by independent contractors. Started with Mr. José Vitorino and the Avila couple, the Santos, Mr. Simas, etc. These were independent contractors. So, and that continued in the radio world in the 1960s and 70s and 80s as well, and even a little bit into the 90s. And these were folks, such as I did when I was 18 years old. You would buy an hour from a radio station, an hour or two, and then you brokered it. So you knocked on door to door and you got advertising, and you hopefully made a couple of bucks. I never did, but many people did very, very well. It was a form of to supplement their income, and some of them actually made a living out of these programs themselves. And so it was a very important part of the community. And Mr. Mendonça, when he began his program in the 1940s in Merced, his program was actually part of the radio station. So the radio station did not ask Mr. Mendonça to buy the time and broker it. They contracted him and paid him so much an hour for him to do 1 hour of radio, and the sales staff was the one that got the ads and everything else. He was responsible for producing, moderating, presenting 1 hour of Portuguese radio per day, every single day in the Merced area on an AM radio station. With the Immigration Act or before the Immigration Act, with the Azorian Refugee Act that was put forth, well associated with then young senator from Massachusetts and President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. The Azorian Refugee Act that was put forth in 1958, and then with the, because of the earthquake and the volcano in Capelinhos, and then a new wave of immigration came forth. And then, of course, following that, the Family Reunification Act of the 1960s. With that, then began a new wave of Portuguese radio programs in California. But in the 1950s, there were over 10 Portuguese radio programs in California. In the 1960s, began quite a few of them. So, for example, the Here locally in the central southern part of the valley, in the city of Hanford, Joaquim and Amelia Morrison, their program Ecos do Vale, or Echoes of the Valley, was one of the most famous radio programs, not only in the valley, throughout California. The Morrisons were widely known throughout the state of California for their radio programs and for their involvement in the Portuguese American community. Their program was on Sunday, Sunday evening from 6 until 7:30, a 90-minute program that was basically broadcast out of a local AM radio station that then became KIGS and full-time Portuguese, but at that time KNGS, and AM 620. And the Morrisons continued and kind of revolutionized a little bit of the radio at that time, because they both were very well educated. They were from the island of Fayal. Mrs. Morrison, Dona Amelia Morrison, was an elementary teacher there, and she indeed brought a different level of language to the Portuguese radio throughout the state of California, along with her husband. One of their most interesting tidbits about that radio program was that they did a skit every single Sunday. They did a skit called As Lições do Joaquim, or Joaquim's Lesson. So Mr. Morrison was a student, so he played the role of a 10, 11-year-old student, and Mrs. Morrison was a teacher. The parents had hired Mrs. Morrison to continue teaching this young man how to continue reading and writing in Portuguese. So she was a Portuguese language teacher. So it was fascinating because they taught basically Portuguese on the radio in a fun way. But it was also very social connected, very politically connected to the politics of the community and to the politics of the state and of the nation. As Lições do Joaquim, and it's too bad we do not have them archived, they were kind of a barometer of what was going on in the Portuguese American community. Some of the dilemmas that people had, some of the things that people liked about fascists, some of the things that they did not like, and also an important contribution to the Portuguese community as far as what was going on in America, and the contacts, which weren't, great, but the contacts that people had at that time with the archipelago of the Azores. And I say not great because a lot of the news that the people gave on their radio programs from week to week was news that was at least 5 to 7 days, sometimes even longer, that had happened in Portugal. Sometimes these folks used to get Portuguese newspapers, as I used to get Portuguese newspapers from Portugal, in order to read some of the things that happened. And obviously these newspapers would arrive, sometimes 9, 10, 12, 15 days after, the day that they were published. And so it was more to connect with the community. There's a long history, and I wanted to mention some of the people, and we're going to be doing these segments every single week for the next 4 weeks. There will be at least 2 of them in English and 2 others in Portuguese, and I will have some guests. This is the only day I'm here by my lonesome self, but hopefully you are there on your side. And but some of the names that may bring up some memories to those of you who are older Portuguese American is Artur e Celeste Ávila, as I mentioned, Joaquim Esteves, which we'll talk extensively about him, Francisco e Josefina Canto e Castro, Miguel Canto e Castro, the son, who I've spoken already about, Frank Dias from Sacramento, Maria Cabral from the Bay Area, Maria Souza from the Hanford area, also began a program in the late 50s, Higino Costa, Joaquim e Amélia Morrison, which I mentioned, Ana Calado, Inácio e Margarida dos Santos, Mimi Dias, Idalina Melo, Jorge Azara, or better known as Jorge Azera, Joaquim Correia Sr., Frank Mendonça, which I mentioned, Arnaldo Gonçalves, Agnello Clementino, Camilo Melo, Manuel Leal. These are just a few. There were many, many, many others. These are just a few, and of the different ones. And to give you an example of some of the names of the Portuguese radio programs, and it's just going to be kind of hard for me to translate, but I'll read them in Portuguese. Lots of them were nostalgic names, names that had to do with the motherland, with coming from the Azores and being away from the Azores or from mainland Portugal. Saudades da nossa terra, so missing our land. Recordações de Portugal, remembering Portugal. Ecos Portugueses, Portuguese Echoes, that was the program of Mr. Diaz from Sacramento. Portugal de hoje, today's Portugal, that was the program of the title of the program for Mr. Joaquim Esteves, a true icon in Portuguese radio in California. Memórias de Portugal, memories of Portugal. Saudades de Portugal, again, that wonderful word, our Portuguese word for missing, nostalgia, etc., missing Portugal. Voz da Saudade, interesting, voice of saudade or voice of the nostalgia, the missing. Recordar a viver, remembering is living. And of course others. Jardim dos Açores, a very romantic name, Garden of the Azores. Sonhos de Portugal, or Dreams of Portugal, also a very, very important radio program put forth during many decades by a young man from the island of Faial, Aires Medeiros, who I knew quite well, my family as well, and who actually also did a wonderful job in Portuguese radio in California. Amor de Pátria, still existing. Amor de Pátria is broadcast by Eduardo Paim, and his program still continues. He started on KCOK. He also was part of the KTBB experience. Then he went to KIGS, and now he is on internet with several different radio stations, including Radio Portugal USA, Radio Portugal USA. And others, Melodias de Portugal, Melodies of Portugal, Voz do Imigrante, Voice of the Immigrant, O Imigrante Português, the Portuguese Immigrant, and as I mentioned, Portugal na Califórnia, Portugal in California, Voz da Lusitânia, Lusitânia, the territory before Portugal, Voz da Lusitânia, Voice of Lusitânia, Voz do Atlântico, Atlantic Voice, Ecos dos Açores, Echoes of the Azores, Saudades dos Açores, Missing the Azores, As Nove Pérolas dos Açores, the Nine Pearls of the Azores, Portugal em Marcha, Portugal Marching, Portugal Going Forward, Voz da Nossa Terra, Saudades da Nossa Terra, and Voz do Imigrante Português, by the way, is the one that I began in 1977, or Voice of the Portuguese Immigrant. So lots of these names, there were others, Hora Portuguesa, Voz Portuguesa, here in the valley, in the Tulare, Kings County area, I have a list of all the Portuguese radio programs, and they were, let me just read them to you. They were Programa Portugal, Ecos dos Açores, Ecos do Val, Melodias de Portugal, Voz da Lusitânia, Aurora de Portugal, from a very famous lady, Idalina Melo, Adeline Melo, Hora de Recreio, Portugal Terra de Fé, Estrelas de Portugal, Sol de Portugal, Amor da Pátria, Pérola dos Açores, Pensamentos de Portugal, Voz do Imigrante Português, Voz Portuguesa, Saudades da Pátria, Portugal na Califórnia, and there were others that came and went really, really quickly, but were also part of the radio history here in California. So these were the radio programs that at one time, and the research firm Dr. Eduardo Paim Dias confirms that in the 1960s and 70s, at one time we had over 50 Portuguese radio programs, all the way from San Diego. Paulo Goulart had a program called Hora Portuguesa, and there was a gentleman that had one before him as well. To Artesia, to Chino, Tony Freitas had a program there for a very long time as well. The valley was very rich. From Tulare South all the way up to Stockton and including Sacramento, the valley was very, very rich in Portuguese programs, as was the Bay Area, as was the area in Watsonville and Monterey and Salinas. Also were very rich in Portuguese radio programs, and then later on programs in the northern part of San Francisco and Petaluma, a couple of radio programs as well. So over 50 radio programs in the 1960s and 70s. Many of them continued into the 80s. So what happened to Portuguese radio throughout this time? And why was it so important? First of all, I had a lady once tell me, an elderly lady who has passed on, and who I used to basically have long conversations about the Portuguese American community. She had come here as a very young child. When I met her, she was already in her 70s. And she used to say that the Portuguese radio basically was their world. The Portuguese radio told them everything they needed to know. Many people, when they arrived here in the 1960s, the second and last wave of immigration of the 1960s, they found jobs through Portuguese radio. Portuguese radio programs. I interviewed Miguel Canto y Castro for the Portuguese American Hour on KGST, and he told me if he had $1 for every single job that he got for Portuguese Americans when they arrived, his program, now 59 years of age, he'd have quite a bit of money. And so it was a way to connect the community. They also built community. Lots of the programs had members. Some did not. Some did not believe in it, but lots of them did have members. And you paid $1 per year to become a member of a Portuguese radio program. What did they give you? Well, that the radio personality would jot down your birthday, if you were a family, so the husband, the wife, a couple of the kids, and they would mention your birthday. And that was a big deal, your birthday, your anniversary. They dedicate you a song, you and a few other people. But it was a way for people to maintain some connection. Remember, this is way before the internet and iPhones and everything else. And it built community because it brought everyone together as well. In the South Valley, and actually throughout the Valley and even in the Bay Area, the Portuguese radio programs used to celebrate their anniversary. They used to have a festa de aniversário, their anniversary festa. It was usually a dance. Sometimes it was a dinner. If it was a dance, many of them here in the south end of the valley just had a dance with a musical group, a Portuguese musical group. At that time, they also only charged $1 entrance fee to go to the festa. They had to pay, obviously, the rental of the hall. Some of the halls gave a little bit of a break, others didn't. And they besides having $1 per person, you would also have free coffee and massa cevada. It was a tradition that the Portuguese radio program Festa of the 1970s and 80s, and I think they mostly died out in the late 70s, early 80s, that they would have a Festa, and that this Festa would have a Portuguese band and would have also free of charge massa cevada and coffee and punch. And so how did the radio program even make any money? And it was a way to supplement the income of the Portuguese radio hour that you had to pay. And so people would do the massa cevada for free. Some people would donate the coffee or the sugar for the coffee. People were very generous with that. And also each one of these events would always have some kind of a raffle or some kind of an auction to bring some funds in, because obviously even with just $1 a person, if you were able to get 300 people, and most of them did, you were able to get 350 people, that was only $350. So that barely paid for the group. But there were other ways that you could also obviously fundraise for your radio program. Also, a lot of the people that were involved in radio, this wasn't a full-time job for them. Very few people, it was a full-time job. Joaquim Esteves was involved in business, and he made it a full-time job because he himself was involved in very different businesses. But most people, it was just a part-time. It still is for those who are involved in Portuguese radio independent programs. But it's supplemented, and a lot of times it was a way to connect with the community, and it was done because lots of these radio personalities were involved in some kind of a job that was involving sales. So it was a way to get your name out. So you either sold cars, or you sold insurance, or you were a travel agent, or notary public, or you were a manager of a store, or something like that. So it was a way to get your name out, to get your product that you were representing or that you were working with out as well. And these programs, in a time where the festas were not as abundant as they are today. Each community always had a festa. The festas are over 100 years old, as the radio is, now 100. But basically, in many communities, there was that one or two festas a year. The Festa do Espírito Santo, and then the Festa das Contas, which was usually about 2 or 3 months later to give the financial report, and there were sopers given out again. And then throughout the year, there weren't many other festas. Many of these festas that are now part of our social calendar of the Portuguese American community in California were festas that began 45, 50, maybe even 55, 60 years ago. And even then, it wasn't this flux of festers that we have now. So the radio programs came and gave a bit of a social activism, let's put it this way, to the Portuguese American community. And it was a way for people to get out of the house and to see each other because especially in rural areas, people were far apart from each other in the valley, and in metropolitan areas, people were close to each other as far as some neighborhoods where there were more Portuguese Americans that lived close to each other, but people were working hard. Lots of them had 2 and 3 jobs, and so it was only through these Portuguese radio program festas that they were able to see their friends and their family and to socialize. The Portuguese radio programs changed significantly when KRVE, that we'll talk extensively about in about 2 weeks, and so I don't want to mention a lot about KRVE in San Jose, but when that radio station began, and then when they contracted 2 professionals that we talked about here on our first segment of these virtual conferences. We had 4 different radio personalities, and we talked quite extensively about the professionalization of the so-called professionalization of radio. Because my perspective, and this is editorial on my part, my perspective is that the Portuguese radio programs in California were professional in their own way. They communicated with people. That's what radio is all about. Radio is about communicating, and they were excellent at it. By having the members, by having the birthdays, by acknowledging the anniversaries, by acknowledging someone when they got promoted, by acknowledging people when they went to the Azores and came back, and all kinds of events in families' lives that now we use Facebook for, or Instagram or Twitter or anything else. Before all of this, it was through the radio. And so they communicated with their audience. And if that's not professional, I don't know what it is, because the beauty of radio is to communicate. And although they may have not had the best Portuguese, they may have not had the best way of doing radio. Sometimes it was choppy, but they were able to communicate, and they were able to keep the cultural and the language alive. I am of the belief that if today in California, we still speak Portuguese, and I don't mean the Portuguese, the people that are here, have been here by 20 or 25 years, but I'm talking about, in general, we see people who were born here who speak Portuguese. We see people whose grandparents were born here and they still speak Portuguese. So if the community in general still speaks Portuguese, I think it is because, obviously, first, the families that put an effort into it. Let's not take that away. Second, I think the Portuguese radio programs. Let's remember that the Portuguese radio programs, the over 50 that existed in the 1960s and 70s, this was before we had many or all of the Portuguese radio, of the Portuguese education in the different schools, or even private education. The community schools are something brand new. There's something of the last 30, 35 years. The teaching Portuguese at high schools and elementary school is something also of the last 30, 35, I think the longest around 40 years. So 50 years ago, when we had basically, dozens of Portuguese radio programs that continued the language alive. People were able to not only talk with their spouses, with their family, with their friends in Portuguese, but they were able to listen to it every single day, because every single community, even like Tulare, for example, for a long time, only our good friend Lucianoia had a half hour a day, but she had a half hour a day in Portuguese every morning from 6 to 6:30. I can tell you that I was milking cows when I was 14, 15 years old with my father, and I used to listen to Lucia, and I used to get yelled at by my father because she would read poetry, and I love poetry, and so I would sit and listen to poetry instead of taking care of milking the cows, and so I would be yelled constantly. But besides that, there were other programs. So it was Lucia every single day, Monday through Friday from 6 to 6:30. But there were other people that had programs on Thursday, on Saturday, and then, of course, most of Saturday evening and all day Sunday. So people were able to listen to the music. People were able to listen to their friends. People were able to listen to these people who spoke Portuguese, and people were able to know information about their friends that was shared throughout the radio. The other thing that's fascinating also to remember is when Mr. José Vitorino began his radio show in 1920, and even when Mr. Avila and his wife Rosinha, Celeste, better known as Rosinha, began in 1930, and some of those early ones, they didn't have records. Today, no one has records, but I am of the generation of going to a radio station with records. They didn't. They had live music. So they had to, when they started a radio program, it was a bit of a task because they also had to find people who knew how to play a musical instrument and were willing to spend that hour or whatever time they had with them. And that's why at the early shows of Mr. and Mrs. Avila, they didn't have much music because it was hard to find someone who would be with them every single day, Monday through Friday, to play music. They would only have a couple of days out of the week. The others was just basically a talk show talking about the community, doing poetry. They were very, very literate, and their program was very literary program. And so in the 1970s with KRVE and the professionalization of that, some of the radio programs began to dwindle, the so-called independent radio programs. In 1980, that changed even a little bit more in the 1980s. And in the South Valley, for example, that changed as well. There were some experiences which we'll talk about in detail with the Portuguese closed circuit radio, one that began in 1982 by myself and Joaquim Correia Jr. And we had a DJ from Portugal that had come recently from Terceira Island, Henrique Dedel, who has passed, and then in 1989 here in the and also in the Tulare area began King's Tulare Portuguese Broadcasting, KTPB, which was the first 24-hour-a-day Portuguese radio station in California. It was also closed circuits. The radio programs were all having issues with their radio stations, and they kind of all joined forces and began KTPB in 1989. And shortly after that, KIGS began, and of course things, but for a while it was great. The Portuguese in the Valley actually had 2 radio stations, and this is south of the Valley. And then by this time, we had KLBS in Los Banos, who had been broadcasting Portuguese since 1961 with Miguel Canticastro and other Portuguese independent programmers, but then was bought out by Mr. Batista Vieira, who we will have here his son, David Vieira, and we'll talk about that whole project as well. So, today, the Portuguese radio programs throughout California, the independent ones, are mostly in doing broadcasting through internet radio stations, and that is obviously the new way to communicate. We still have Portuguese radio, as all of you know. KLBS is still broadcasting all day long in Portuguese in Los Banos. KSQQ in San Jose has a few hours per day, also in Portuguese in the San Jose Morgan Hill area, and then the rest of the programs, whether it be Rádio Lusolândia in Artesia, whether it be Rádio Portugal USA in Newark, these are all, or whether it be Rádio Lusa in the Turlock area. There's a couple other ventures in the Turlock area, Turlock Hilmar. All of these, there's about 4 or 5 different ones that are internet radio. It's a little bit different. The Portuguese community is not as dependent on Portuguese radio as they were then, certainly in 1920, but even in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Today, we have a way to connect with Portugal momentaneously. We didn't have that in the 1920s, certainly, and we certainly did not have it even in the 1960s, 70s, or 80s. We just tell you to end this this chat. We're going to try to keep these around 45 to 50 minutes or so when I do not have a guest. With guests, we'll keep them to an hour. These, by the way, are being recorded. They will be up on our YouTube channel, and they'll be recorded and transcribed as part of the Portuguese Oral History Project for the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute at California State University, Fresno. But the role of the Portuguese radio, so some of you who are of Portuguese background, obviously I've been in contact with lots of different folks because of PBBI, and it amazes me how even folks who don't speak Portuguese, and that's why we're doing a few of these in English, but have some stories about the Portuguese radio. I'd love to hear those stories, and we'd love to have a session where you all participate, because it would be very important to register those stories as well. If you were raised in the Valley in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and even 80s, radio was a very, very important part. So I'd like to start registering some testimonials from all of you, and here's an open invitation. We will put forth another one of these with ample time for we to register lots of different testimonials, because the idea is to get everyone's testimonial about how radio was important to them. Also in 1980, the Terceira Island, Terceira, Graciosa, and São Jorge in the archipelago of the Azores had massive earthquake, particularly in Terceira, but felt in the other two islands. There was massive destruction, as many of you probably remember. It was 40 years ago, so it's been a while. If you're under 40, obviously you don't remember. If you're just a little bit over 40, you're a baby. But if you are in your 50s or late 40s, 50s, and 60s, and older than that, you obviously remember. And we all had, at that time, mostly weekend programs, other than the half-hour day. And a couple of broadcasters here, independent broadcasters, contacted at that time KCOK, 1270 AM, was the radio station that had most of the Portuguese broadcasting independently here in the Valley. They contacted the radio station, and the radio station gave them 1 hour per day. So we could have information from Portugal through Radio Lages. I myself was on the phone, costing a lot of money at the time, trying to get information for my Sunday morning show, trying to get something live to have a few days after the earthquake of what was going on, because phone lines were down and it was very, very hard. The Radio Club d'Angra was not working. And so a lot of the first information that we received was from the military base, the Portuguese radio station at Lages Field. And they did an outstanding job in furnishing that over the phone to KCOK, and this group of people began broadcasting, and I believe it lasted a couple of months. The KCOK made a special price, and they were able to get some advertisers and pay for this venture. Out of that, actually, two other gentlemen and myself, Aires Madruga da Silva, who has passed on, and Joe Silva, we talked extensively about this, and we felt, we really need a daily Portuguese radio program. And that's why in that year, 1980, later on that year, we began something called Radio Aliança 80, and it was a 2-hour a day on FM radio, 8 to 10 p.m. A radio show that had news. We had a connection with Mr. Frank Dias in Sacramento, and we had anywhere between a 10 to 12-minute news segment that came from Portugal directly that day. So it was fresh news that day from Portugal. And besides that, then I, on my free time, didn't have much, but found some and translated to what came in the newspaper and the Tulare Advanced Register and the Visalia Times Delta, and we had about a 7 to 10 minute segment of local news as well. And people depended on this because we still had a very young generation of Portuguese Americans who had come recently from Portugal and who didn't know English quite well, who were just learning the language. And so the Portuguese Radio Aliança 80 was innovative. We didn't have members. We just had our sponsors and music segments. And of course, we had lots of information. And people people enjoyed it because it was different. It was something that brought them the local news and information that they needed. So the trajectory of radio has also been the trajectory of our community. In closing, I think that even though it is different, that is why the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute took on this venture of doing the Portuguese American Hour at KGST. It's now in English. The Portuguese American Hour is in English because that's what the station requested that it be in English, but gave us an opportunity to have 1 hour per day, Monday through Friday, from 4 to 5 p.m. to talk about all that is Portuguese throughout the Valley and throughout the state of California, and even obviously some other parts of the U.S. where Portuguese communities reside, and a connection to the Portuguese-speaking world throughout the world, Portugal, Brazil, etc. Because we have, It's a project that takes a lot of time for PBBI, but we believe it's a service that we need to keep talking about our legacy. We need to keep talking at a different level. Maybe now we have less and less people who speak Portuguese. We have many more Portuguese language programs than we did in 1970, certainly when none of them existed. But we have, they didn't exist at a high school and elementary level, very few, or I believe only one. And at college level, there were a few of them already. And maybe we have a lot more programs in schools. We have a lot more students taking Portuguese, but we have a lot less fluency because the students that are going to take Portuguese, whether it be in the evening at a community school or at a high school, they don't know the language. They may know abre a porta, fecha a janela. They may know a couple of phrases that their grandparents or great-grandparents taught them, but that's where it stops. At that time, in the 1970s, it was obviously the other way around. So we at the Portuguese American Hour now try to keep the culture alive through the music that is in Portuguese, most of it, and of course through information and dialogue about the Portuguese American community in California. But I believe that Portuguese radio programs are still essential and are still important. The audiences are dwindling, and it's not just here. Our first session, we had one of the owners from WJFD, which is a very potent radio station in Massachusetts, where there are lots and lots of Portuguese American communities in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. WJFD has 50,000 watts, so it's a very powerful station. And the owner said it's very tough. She could be making a lot more money if she had the radio station working in English instead of Portuguese. So the community is changing immensely. And that is why the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute exists to register these changes, to archive our history. We don't have a very good history in archive. We have a great history. We've been here in California for over 150 years, but a lot of the stories have gone to the grave. PBBI wants to archive these stories, these presence of the Portuguese American communities throughout the state of California. And part of it is, of course, this radio centennial. It is 100 years on June 10th of 1920 that Mr. José Vitorino began his radio program. We'd like to honor his memory. We'd like to honor all of those who have given countless hours to Portuguese language programs and through the Portuguese radio, and by registering these stories, by registering the history here at the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute. Thank you all so much for being part of this session. We hope to see you every single Thursday through the month of June and a couple in July as well at 3 o'clock on Thursdays, 3 o'clock Pacific time. So we will be having some guests already next week. Next week, the session will be in Portuguese, and then the following week, we'll have David Vieira from the Vieira family that began KRVE and KSQQ and KLBS Portuguese radio in California, owes a lot to the Vieira family, and David will be our guest here as we will have a conversation about their involvement as well. Again, we thank you for being parts of this conference series. We hope that you will tell your friends and your family about it. And we hope that if you have a Portuguese language program story to tell, whether it be in Portuguese or English, that you get a hold of me and that we tell it here on through these different platforms that we have, so it can be registered at the Portuguese Beyond Borders Institute at the California State University of Fresno. Thank you all so much. We appreciate you being here with us, and please stay healthy and safe. And viva a Rádio Portuguesa na Califórnia. And of course, kudos to Mr. José Vitorino for 100 years ago on June 10th of 1920, having the vision to begin something that helped the community tremendously and still continues today. Thank you so much.